So now we're going to think about medieval Rome that the popes inherited when they returned to the city in the 15th century. And we're going to think about a very different way of understanding streets and squares or piazzas with respect to the buildings around them. And when the popes returned in the 15th century, they returned to a city that was much, much smaller than the ancient Roman city, which itself had a population of perhaps over 1 million people. After the fall of the Roman Empire, what was left of the population moved up into this area when the ancient city known as the Campus Martius, in the bend of the Tiber River, not too far from the Church of St. Peter's, for a number of reasons, access to water and proximity to St. Peter's being maybe the two most important. And they moved here, and they essentially cannibalized the monumental buildings that had been here, built by the ancient Romans. The Romans had used this area, which they had called the Field of Mars, because it was essentially a large military parade ground in the early history of Rome. And they built a whole series of monumental complexes here, stadiums, bath complexes, temple complexes, and more or less all of those were organized on a kind of a north-south grid, if you like. But when that reduced population of the medieval city moved into this area, they essentially cannibalized that monumental complex and really, literally dismantled the buildings to make new buildings and to make the stuff of which they would frame their new buildings. Some of the essentially networks of streets and open spaces of that ancient Roman system survived in a fragmentary way, but much of what's happened here and much of what we see in this map, which is an 18th century map of the city by Gian Battista Noli, still does represent a lot of that texture of the medieval city, which was much more winding and irregular than the ancient area of the Campus Martius had ever been. It really is almost like a labyrinth. One can sometimes easily get lost in it. Now, it was the challenge, though, of the Renaissance papacy to give this labyrinth of space a kind of order. And what I want you to think about in this part of this introduction to streets and squares are the ways in which streets and squares can be seen as carved out of that matrix of dense urban buildings, tightly packed together, where the streets and squares really are almost excavated as if you were carving into a block of clay. So that's what I want to get you to think about. A different way of laying out streets and squares than that idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate with streets and squares laid out and then buildings built afterwards. Here we're going to consider the buildings a kind of dense matrix of stuff. Architects would call this the ground, and they would call the open space the figure. So architects talk about figure and ground. The ground, if you like, the buildings, is, you can also think of it in a way as the background. Now, out of that, sometimes it emerges a kind of pattern of streets that is a survivor from ancient Rome. And one of those streets in this area was known in the Middle Ages as the Via Recta, the straight street, because it was one of the few straight streets that had survived from antiquity in this part of town. It was also known as, and still is today, as the Via dei Coronari. And it was one of the major streets, and it was probably surviving because of this reason, that took you to the Ponte San Angelo and therefore on to St. Peter's. So the primary streets in this neighborhood would have been those that preserved that pattern of conducting you towards the Ponte San Angelo and to St. Peter's. The other primary one in this area was the one known as the Via Papalis, or the Papal Way, and we'll actually walk on this route in the last section of the course. The Via Papalis was in fact winding, and it wound its way through this fabric and connected St. Peter's off our map here up to the left to the Church of San Giovanni in Laterano, the Cathedral of Rome, well off the map here to the lower right. And that street was important because it conducted either the Pope to the Lateran or, again, pilgrims to St. Peter's, and it was only relatively wider. So there is a kind of hierarchy in the streets here, just like there was a hierarchy in that ancient Roman city, the Cardo and the Decumanus being the most important and therefore wider, more principally located. and the other streets narrower and secondary. And here too, there were primary streets and secondary streets, primary ones being those that were the longest, if not the straightest, and that connected important things, and that were generally wider, if only a little bit, than the stuff around them. There was a whole sort of layer of secondary streets in between these streets, some of which connected these primary streets, some of which existed in parallel to them, and they were generally narrower and generally not quite as long or continuous. And then there were open spaces. The primary one in this area is, in fact, again, like the Via Recta, a survivor from ancient Rome. It's Piazza Navona. Piazza Navona was, in ancient Rome, the stadium of Domitian. And it survived as an open space, even though people built on essentially the bleachers or the stands that made up the stadium, and built houses and eventually churches on that kind of surrounding of the open space of the Roman stadium. But the open space of the stadium survived, and it became the primary piazza in this neighborhood, the largest one at least. It has a very clear shape. It's that kind of hairpin shape that was proper to the Roman stadium, which was essentially a foot racing track. And it became a kind of primary organizing principle, again, because it was organized more or less on that north-south axis of all the ancient Roman monumental stuff. But even though it wasn't carved out by medieval builders or the Renaissance papacy, it looks like it was carved out of that matrix of stuff around it, because it is so clear in its shape, so large, and the stuff around it really does seem to shape it or define it. That the space, in many ways, it's what's left over after the buildings take their form, even though the space itself, in a way, seems to be conditioning those buildings or determining where they end. So that idea that the space is carved out is really fundamental to understanding Rome, because it helps us understand buildings as not the most important thing, but the space is the most important thing, partly because it was so precious, because there was so little of it, because it was so densely inhabited, but partly also because it had important symbolic or ceremonial functions for events that take place there, for processional routes, or for the routes of pilgrims who are the sort of primary visitors to the city. Now, there also are some minor versions of these streets and squares here in this area of the Abitato. One small one that we're going to be looking at as we take a little detour off of the Via Papalis in the last section of the course is a street that takes you to a small little church of Santa Maria della Pace, which was a 15th century church and transformed in the middle of the 17th century with a new facade and a new piazza. And the piazza here really was carved out around that semicircular facade built by the architect Pietro da Cortona. So the church gets a tiny little facade. It gets a new space that really was carved out, reshaping the buildings around it, literally cutting into them to make a symmetrical space, not a simple shape like Piazza Navona's hairpin shape, but at least an ordered, symmetrical shape. And from there, a narrow little street would lead off past the church to the right, and an older street and a longer one would connect to the Via dei Coronari up here to the left. So there's a case of a kind of fork in the road that was really marked and celebrated and enriched, but it's incredibly intimate. I mean, that space is almost the same size as one of the fountains here in Piazza Navona. So it's not really a question of size. The quality of these spaces have a lot to do with the character of the buildings around them, how clearly defined they are, how much they feel like an outdoor room, and that sense in which they feel like an outdoor room is in many ways a consequence of this way of thinking about urban space. Because when space is primary and the buildings are secondary stuff, space takes on an extra kind of importance. It's not what's left over around the buildings, but in many ways it is the reason that the buildings take the forms that they do. And so we're going to be looking at a number of piazzas and streets and experiencing them in Rome. But it's important before we do that you grasp essentially how different this way of thinking about cities and streets and squares is from that either older way of the ancient Romans or the more modern way of laying out cities.